2, 1. Hi, folks. It's been about 3 months since the last time we did a console wars discussion.
Means it's high time for a new one.
That's the thing. That's it. We got it.
There's no more consoles, though.
We got to keep going back.
We're going back in time again.
No, we've done all the consoles.
No, we haven't.
All of the consoles that exist.
So last time we've been going backwards. So we started with basically the generation before the one that had basically just ended. So we had the 7th gen, we did 6th gen, we did 5th gen 3 months ago. This time we're doing 4th gen, and for those who don't know, this is a big one because this is the 16-bit era. This is your Super Nintendo, your SEGA Genesis, and others. There's actually quite a bit of hardware that we're going to talk about. I have a decent list. It's not everything, but it is most of the important stuff. So just as some little cliff notes, this generation started in 1989 for most of the world. Technically, it started in Japan in 1987, but we're going to go with 1989. And it basically was near its end between 1995 and 1996 when the next generation of hardware was trickling out. So it was a decent length generation. Now, it's mostly known for, obviously, being the generation of 16-bit games. We have a lot of pushing the limits of sprite-based games, but we also had basic 3D elements for games depending on the hardware you're playing on. Like, for instance, you had some Mode 7 shenanigans with like some Super Nintendo games, and you've got some other hardware that can do like pseudo 3D. So we started getting into like very basic 3D gaming at this time. But we have, and speaking of CD, like jumps in technology, we also had CD-based games were like a big thing in this generation. Not as like the base model of most systems. We were still on cartridges for the most part for that. But later on in the generation, there'd be a lot of companies experimenting with CD-ROMs since they were a big new technology that was booming at the time. They were like, hey, we can put games on these. So we're going to talk about some stuff that use that. It is the first major generation for handheld gaming. It's not the first one in general. There was some stuff before this, but like this is the first generation where like there's actually a like sampling and like a competition between some handhelds, however lopsided it is. And I just want to mention there's going to be one system we're not going to talk about in this podcast because it was released in Japan exclusively, and Landon calls it fake, but it was called the FM Towns Marty, and it was known for being installed in cars.
It was known for being fake.
It was known for being fake.
It's true. He made it up.
So I'm just going to go down the list of hardware we're going to focus on talking about. I've grouped these into 3 segments. You've got the main home consoles, and caveat, we've got the NEC TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine, depending on where you were. The SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive, again, depending on where you were. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System or the Super Famicom, again, depending on where you were. And then the Neo Geo, there was the MVS, which was the arcade cabinet, and the AES, which is their like home console version. And they basically play the same games. They were made to have the same games in them. So those are the home consoles, the major ones. But we also had some handhelds, as I mentioned. We got the Nintendo Game Boy, the Atari Lynx, and the Sega Game Gear. And then you've got, I've got a set of 3 pieces of hardware that are a little weird. So first is the NEC Turbo Express, which is essentially the Sega Nomad of this generation, but it was actually released in the same generation where like Sega Nomad was like, you can play portable Genesis games. And that had been released like at the beginning of the next generation. Well, the Turbo Express is that for the TurboGrafx. So it's a handheld version. You can play your TurboGrafx games that way. You had the Philips CDI. That's
hell yeah.
That was
wrong.
It was, so it's not technically a game system, but it is a multimedia player and it had games. So
It is It might not be fake, but it is wrong.
It is wrong, and I agree with that. And then, of course, you had some peripherals, namely, you have the Sega Mega CD, or just Sega CD, and that is something that we'll talk about later. But before we jump into discussing these systems a little more broadly, I would like to ask you guys what your first exposure to this generation of gaming was.
Obviously I'm far too young to have like a lot of firsthand experience with these consoles. I mean, I own a Super Nintendo, but like as a child, bits and pieces of playing other people's Genesises or Super Nintendos, but very, very little growing up. I mean, obviously, like I have played and I love a lot of the games on these systems, but like in terms of like exposure, not much until I started like emulating shit when I was a teenager.
Okay. So because of how I grew up, I experienced several generations of systems basically in very quick succession. And the first couple were like basically long after they were like the main generation. So this was my first main generation, I would say, of hardware that I really was like deep in experiencing. Because that said, I did play the NES first, but it was my only experience with that generation of hardware, really. But immediately after first playing the NES, as I had mentioned in a previous podcast, my mom got the budget versions of the Genesis and the Super Nintendo at the time. My sister would end up getting the Genesis. I would end up getting the Super Nintendo. And we basically were able to experience a lot of games by both of us having those systems. And I also got a Game Boy Color, but to be fair, I didn't play a whole lot of actual Game Boy Color games as much as I did Game Boy games. So I do have a lot more experience with the library of this generation's games, kind of all at once before jumping into like 3D games. So this is my first one. I don't remember exactly what my first games were. I have to assume I think Super Mario World was among them. Goof Troop was in an early one. Sonic 1, 2, and Mean Bean Machine were among on the Genesis side. And then, of course, Pokemon for Game Boy, and I think the Smurfs Game Boy game that I talked about in a couple of different episodes was another early one for Game Boy. So that's a lot, but it was all in a very short span of time.
I think the first thing I played was Tetris for the Game Boy.
That explains a lot.
Remember, yeah. I know my mom had an original Game Boy with Tetris. So I'm pretty sure like that was like one of the first things I played. I know I played a bit of the Sonic games on Genesis as well. We didn't own a Genesis, but who would become my stepbrother, they had they weren't at the time, but when we would go over and visit them, because parents were friends, my mom, their father. So
Gotcha.
I would play. I remember some of the like. I think it was for sure Genesis. I remember Sonic. I think Sonic Spinball was a game. I don't think I played much of it, but I remember that was like I distinctly remember the cover for that. And then a little bit of Super Nintendo, but it was definitely more skewed towards Genesis on that. And then I would play some of the library for Game Boy on Game Boy Color because I had the Pokemon Yellow edition. So I guess Pokemon too. Pokemon was like the first, because Pokemon Yellow is a Game Boy game.
It is.
That was the first one I owned was that.
Okay.
Even though that was more so really the next generation by the time that was like out and available. Still like, well, it's a Game Boy game. Fuck it.
Right. Because it was a third pillar release of the original releases, Red and Green. They were like very tail end of this generation.
It was a fourth pillar release, actually.
Technically, yes, correct. Yeah, because Red and Green, when they originally came out in Japan, they were early 1996. So that was still within this generation. So
Yeah. I mean, they are Game Boy games. They are
Yep.
labeled as Game Boy games. Even the US releases up through that. And I think isn't
So
Gold and Silver
Gold
are technically
Gold and Silver are Game Boy Color, but they can be played on a Game Boy with monochrome. Pokemon Yellow is in Japan, it's a Game Boy game. In outside of Japan, it is technically a Game Boy Color game. But
even though they use the Game Boy, like use a Game Boy cartridge, Game Boy label, and everything.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Crystal's the only one that is truly a Game Boy Color game.
Yeah, you cannot play that on a regular Game Boy.
Yeah, that's why it's like confusing. But yeah.
Yep.
Anyway,
so
that was the first one I know I owned.
So let's just go ahead and start talking about these systems one by one. I organized these slightly by release, although I grouped two particular ones together. I wonder why. But let's start with the first system on our list, which is the NEC TurboGrafx 16 PC Engine, which was originally released over here in North America on August 29th, 1989. It had a lot of different configurations. Some later models included a later released CD add-on to play these CD games. And as far as the specifically CD-ROM variant of this console, because that is considered a separate thing, everything else actually sold a little over 7.5 million units. So not like a lot, but not a terrible amount. Now, this was a joint venture between NEC and Hudson Soft. Yes, that Hudson Soft actually helped make this system. And NEC manufactured and sold it, basically. A few games you might recognize that this system had were the original Bomberman games. You had the Bonks games, like Bonks Adventure, and the original Splatterhouse. So, not necessarily like the most high-profile games, but honestly, a notable batch of games here. Does anybody have experience with the PC Engine TurboGrafx out of us? Because I will say,
not even a little.
Unfortunately, I do not.
I probably have the most indirect experience, and by that I mean I played Wii Virtual Console games, and mostly specifically, I played Dungeon Explorer.
How is that game? That was another game that I had saw a while.
It's really fun, and it's surprising. It's like pretty deep for what it is. But like for an RPG, like an action RPG that you can have up to 5 people play at one time, it's like really neat. I really enjoyed my time playing that. So yeah, that's really the only experience I have with anything TurboGrafx, which is unfortunate because otherwise, like I've heard like solid things about the hardware, and depending on your tastes in games, like the library is pretty good.
Yeah. It's a bit more niche, especially as like when you take everything as a whole, but from what I've heard as well, solid library of like underground sleeper hits. So maybe it might be worth looking into. Next system that we're going to talk about is one of the two big boys of this generation, the Sega Mega Drive Genesis.
Is the other big boy the Game Boy? Because that's the biggest boy of this generation.
I meant as far as consoles, but yes, you're right. But the Genesis originally released in North America on August 14th, 1989. And it also has several different models. The first two were actually from Sega themselves. And the second one actually notably included a 6-button controller that they started selling. And the third one was actually from Majesco, and Tectoy also had a fourth set of basically like official Genesis models, but they're not like Sega official, but Tectoy was like allowed to like legally release their own versions.
They're Brazil official.
Yeah,
that's kind of crazy.
It's
honestly.
namely for Brazil. Yeah,
It is
and
100%.
and that is that's also why the Master System sold really well, I believe, is Tectoy also handled that one, right?
Oh, the Master System is like, even to this day, like one of
It's
Brazil's like
best-selling systems of all
favorite.
time.
Yeah. I remember a couple years back, a friend and I were at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and we were talking to like someone from Brazil, like that had a vendor booth there, and he was pretty much like, "Yeah, it's the fucking shit there. It's like crazy."
All right.
So it's at like even like the internet hype around like how much Brazil likes it. It's like true. It's
true.
funny.
Yeah. But to continue with the Genesis, all of these models that I mentioned combined have sold at least 35 million units, is the estimate. Now, the vast majority of these are Sega's models, which are 30 million. Now, I forgot to get like exact sales data as far as United States specifically. Unfortunately for this one and the next one, which are going to be kind of important, but a pretty respectable amount of sales, as you can see. Did receive several add-ons, most notably for this podcast. We've got the Sega CD, which is counted as this part of this generation. There was the 32X. We talked about that in the last generation console wars that we talked about, because it is technically part of that generation. For some reason, add-ons, they can go to different generations. It's kind of weird. I do want to add a fun fact from what I did get to like look up. It almost overtook the Super Nintendo in the US, but it did sell ultimately about 1.5 million less than it. Again, I don't have the exact numbers. I know it's like mid 20 million or so for each of them, with Sega just being a little under the Super Nintendo there. That is according specifically to a 2014 report from a firm that was using revised NPD data. You got a lot of good games though on the Genesis. We've talked about a lot of them, but just to go over a few, you got Altered Beast, you got the Sonic the Hedgehog games, Vector Man, Ristar, the Phantasy Star titles from 2 through 4. You've got Golden Axe, Shining Force, Gunstar Heroes. You got Streets of Rage, Echo the Dolphin, and there's like a lot of others. Like we could go on all day about the Sega Genesis. So let's talk about the Sega Genesis and hopefully not go on all day about it. Jack, how do you feel about Sega Genesis?
It'll be pretty easy for me. I'm gonna say it now just because I feel like there hasn't really been a good opportunity to bring it up, but this is like excuse me, Jesus. This is like the first and one of the only console generations I can think of where like there were like ad campaigns literally like directly attacking each other like constantly. Like the Nintendo and Sega fucking hated each other in the early 90s. This is the real console war right here.
And this is not like even like an exaggeration either. I did not put this in my notes, but this is also the generation that would cause the US to have its government intervene on behalf of and cause the ESRB to form. Now outside of North America, this affects nobody. This was pretty much just a North America thing, but considering we are such a huge market for these systems in particular, kind of a big deal.
Well, and also like other regions have also developed their own.
Yeah. Did those come after or before?
Well. I will look that up while you guys talk.
All right.
Because
that'd be cool.
Just since you brought that up, I just wanted to mention that it was the two games that were like the root cause of this like entire thing going to court and like causing the birth of the ESRB because of like sensitive content in video games are Mortal Kombat, which makes sense because it's very violent and bloody, and Night Trap, which makes zero sense because it's literally a game where you like try to save young women from like robbers, and like it just goes to show that like since the dawn of time, humanity has had zero media literacy.
Yeah, there is a third game actually. It doesn't get as much publicity because it wasn't quite as contentious. It was kind of agreed upon that that one's kind of messed up, and that was Lethal Enforcers because it included the gun to point at the TV to shoot, and because you were supposed to be playing. The funny thing is, you're supposed to be playing as a cop, like you're supposed to be playing as law enforcement. Not like the lawbreakers, but because it was teaching people to shoot a gun, like
this wasn't even like a Grand Theft Auto type situation.
No, this was like the opposite of a Grand Theft Auto situation. This was prevent the Grand Theft Auto.
But anyway, to talk about the Genesis, honestly, outside of the Sonics, like the vast majority of Sonics that are on this system, I don't have a ton of experience with the Genesis library. Like there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff on the system that I really have not played. Like some stuff I have. Like I've played, the Mortal Kombats, and I've played Echo the Dolphin. I've played Ristar a little bit. I've played fucking, I don't know, NBA Jam. Also, I'm looking at the list of best-selling Genesis games just because I was curious, and the Aladdin game was in the top 5 and outsold Sonic 3 and Knuckles.
Oh yeah, it was extremely popular.
That is very nearly beat Mortal Kombat for best-selling non-pack-in title.
Yeah, it was
on the system.
It was a big deal when people were like talking about the comparison between the Genesis version and the Super Nintendo version. It really was a big deal. That's why Aladdin on the Genesis did so well, is because people were like, wow, this looks like the actual movie. So
even the Super Nintendo version is better.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank God Justin's not here.
True.
Yeah, this would be
the Genesis version of Aladdin.
This would be contentious. I will say I did play quite a lot of Genesis. In fact, I would probably say that like earlier on, I was playing more Genesis than Super Nintendo. Eventually, that would kind of flip, but I grew up on that Sonic 1, Sonic 2, and Mean Bean Machine multi-pack, so I played a lot of that. But I also played The Lion King on both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, which was interesting. I also played quite a bit of stuff like Vector Man. I played that Aladdin game as well at one point. I think there was a RoboCop game that I played a little bit of that I remember being pretty good. I did not play all of the games that like I really got into until a little later, but like, I mean, all the stuff I mentioned when I was like going over the synopsis, a lot of classic titles. The Mickey Illusion games, I believe there's a couple on the Super Nintendo as well, but the ones on the Genesis I remember being pretty iconic. The Genesis version of Toy Story is really impressive for its graphical quality on the Genesis, because like before that Toy Story game came out, people largely didn't think of the Genesis as more visually powerful or even close to the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was doing stuff like Donkey Kong Country, right? So that's pretty big. But they came out with Toy Story, and on the Genesis, it actually like is on that level almost. So that was a pretty big one. Yeah, it's a great system. Like, I mean, we'll get more into like comparing the two, but like I think that the Genesis was like, for some people, it's not their favorite of the Sega consoles. They might have a sleeper pick in like the Dreamcast or the Saturn over this, but I do legit think that the Genesis would be a deserving title of like Sega's best system. Not everybody will agree with that, but I like it a lot.
I think it is, like, only because it has the library.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like, if the Dreamcast had a full lifespan, it could easily have been like Sega's best system. But I think just because the Genesis got a full console run, Plus because of the
it came out
CD
early.
and
Yep.
32X.
It came out early. It had long support into the next generation afterwards. So
yeah, so it like because of that and like the library, like super super solid. I mean, yeah, you guys have mentioned a couple. It's not as strong as the Super Nintendo because it did not have the Square and like Enix like RPGs. Let's just be real. Like it did not have your Final Fantasies and your Dragon Quests, but it does have some really really solid like RPGs. Outside of that, you mentioned Fantasy Star 2 through 4. 4. I mean, you just recently played it. It's toured as one of the like one of the best 16-bit like RPGs out there.
right.
Shining Force 1 and 2 on this thing are both really solid tactical RPGs. You have Beyond Oasis, you have Sword of Vermilion. There's a lot of really really cool stuff, and then you just mix in a lot of the good platformers that are on it, and you've got a fairly solid. And there's a lot of other stuff. Super columns. Like you have some really good like puzzle games on here.
Yep.
That like kind of go toe to toe with a lot of the stuff Nintendo was doing with like Tetris. So yeah, you got some really.
They're
really
pretty good for sports games at the time. Were pretty good on this system as well.
Sports games and fighting games.
Yes.
Like you've got like pretty much like a lot of the major stuff that you would have at this time like is covered in the library. So yeah, that's like just my thoughts. And then to go back to the rating boards, Zero and Peggy were both early 2000 when they came around.
So that was not till way after the ESRB.
I mean, and ESRB was. Let me open that back up because the ESRB wasn't the first of the US's rating boards either.
No.
We had like there was two in the early 90s as this was happening. That kind of caused like that were the fill-ins for ESRB, but I want ESRB's like specific date.
Can't remember the exact date, but it was like 1994.
It was 94. Yeah, it was September 94, but you had, and ESRB also does technically cover Canada. Note that they cover Canada. But the Video Game Rating Council was the first, and then they were in 93, and then prior to the ESRB becoming the standard, it was the Recreational Software Advisory Council for the US.
And are these both separate from Sega having their own separate ratings, or are they connected to one of those two? Because before the ESRB, interestingly, Sega did have their own rating system. It was largely argued as not descriptive and clear enough, which is why there was like this whole movement to establish the ESRB, especially because they wanted like an independent party, not like the manufacturer themselves rating these games. But the Sega was known for like if you have like those games like Sonic, you might have noticed the later games would have like a GA, general audiences.
So yeah, that's this rating. So Video Game Rating Council is that.
Okay.
Like they did all of the Sega games and stuff. So they did, JA. They did MA13, MA17.
Gotcha.
Were like their things.
So
yeah, that was that.
So the SEGA Genesis, really good system, but we have a lot more to talk about. So we'll continue talking about this as we move into the next one.
Recreational Software Advisory Council was independent, nonprofit organization. So just to answer your like full question there.
All right. But the next system we're going to talk about, although it is a little bit after the following system we'll talk about after, chronologically speaking, it's only by like a month and a half, and this one's a lot more comparable to the Genesis. So let's just talk about the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Super Famicom.
Yeah.
which was originally released in North America on August 23rd in 1991, selling 49.1 million units worldwide. It had a number of peripherals released to support it as well, just like the Sega Genesis did, although not to quite the same extent. But you did have stuff like the Super Game Boy, which allow you to play your Game Boy games on the TV through this. Obviously, it is the best-selling home console of this generation. Not system as a whole, but best-selling home console. And I mean, the library's deep, man. You got Super Mario World, you got Super Mario Kart, you got The Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, Super Metroid, you got the Donkey Kong Country games, you got Kirby Superstar, you got Final Fantasy 4 and 6, which we would get as 2 and 3. You had Chrono Trigger, you had Earthbound, you had Secret of Mana,
Trigger.
you had F-Zero. There are so many Super Nintendo games, just the same as we could talk about Genesis games all day. There's a lot of Super Nintendo games.
When we do our little debate at the end, whoever gets the Super Nintendo just has to say Chrono Trigger, and that's it. That's all you need.
One thing, Jack, I think you were bringing up, or Landon, you were definitely bringing this up, actually, now that I think about it. But
I wanted say words on this thing.
I wanted to add, on top of the Super Nintendo having the advantage of the RPGs, because of the
I did say
level
that.
of support. They also had much more support by some other Japanese companies, such as Capcom and Konami.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they did not exclusively support the Super Nintendo. They did have stuff come out on the Genesis, but their support for the Genesis was way smaller than their support for the Super Nintendo. So you're going to see a lot of stuff like Super Castlevania, Mega Man X, and a bunch of other big hitter games from these companies on the Super Nintendo. And you might see something here or there for the Genesis, but it's not quite on that same level most of the time. So
it turns out if you have exclusives, your system does really well. Yeah.
And
crazy, right?
It sucks. Like, I know that there's people out there that are like, adamantly anti-exclusives. But this really was the console war that, exclusives mattered. We're going to get to it later, but
it also goes into like the previous, Generation 3, Nintendo dominates the third generation of consoles because they're just like, you're on our system or you're dead.
Yeah, they were very iron-fisted about it. They were like, you work with us or you don't work with us, and we're the one that has the market. So if you want your games to sell, you work with us. And also, you can only make so many games a year, and we allot you the cartridges and decide how many you get. So like they had almost total control over that sort of thing.
And they continue like that kind of mantra into this, and the only reason they can is because of how dominant they were in the NES era. Because Sega was just trying to grab at what they could for market shares.
Now,
and they fucking did. It is a bloodbath for this generation, but it is
especially here in the States.
Yeah, but because of that dominance and the hardware to back it up in this generation, that you have Square and you have Enix and Capcom and Konami and a lot of great support from some of the top developers.
Let's not dismiss the Genesis here, but we have to say the Super Nintendo is famously known as having just average, highest quality games, some of the highest quality games of all time. Just even still today with all the other systems that you could talk about, the Super Nintendo just has such a high bar that few systems are able to get over.
The level of the game library, overall, is crazy. But I mean, that I feel like some of that also pushed Sega is and that's why we have two very, very great libraries. I think both of these systems, overall.
So we'll jump back into the argument between these guys a little later, but let's keep going, talk about some more stuff. We got the last home console of this, and this one is, as I mentioned, a little weirder. You got the SNK Neo Geo, which was released as both an arcade cabinet and a home console. We're mostly talking about the home console here, not the cabinet, but to be fair, the cabinet does operate the same way, essentially. In fact, the controller for the Neo Geo's home console variant is an arcade pad, so like you are getting the same experience. The arcade cabinet version originally released in North America on August 22nd, 1990. The home console does not have a specific, so technically our official release date is July 1st, 1991. Though there was evidence in old newspapers of it possibly having a 1990 release, so it could have been soft launched in 1990 in a few select areas before a widespread release in 1991. We don't know. We'll just say, for all intents and purposes, 1991, though, July 1st, that is the official release. And it did sell 1.18 roughly million units worldwide. And that's not a lot. And the reason for that is because it had a notably high price tag of $649 in 1990.
Jack, do the quick math on that for us.
A lot.
A lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, exactly.
Thank you for that.
Hold on.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that inflation calculator.
But
hold on, let me look it up.
Let's be fair to the Neo Geo. The Neo Geo has an interesting library of games. You've got some iconic titles such as Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters games, stuff like Alpha Mission 2, Metal Slug. There's a bunch of others. I didn't want to like list too many and start getting into like stuff that like maybe nobody's heard of, but like there's a legit library for the Neo Geo.
I was going to pull it up, and then I was going to like go back to my 4th generation of consoles Wikipedia page that I have open and just pull up the Neo Geo to see what the launch price was, and it literally has the like inflated price on here. It's $1,450.
That is 2 PS5 Pros.
Yeah.
You know what?
Insane.
It's a better It's a better purchase.
Damn.
I would rather buy a Neo Geo.
Speaking of the Neo Geo, though, do you guys have any experience with Neo Geo, even if it's not the system, but just the games? Because the games, you know,
I have played some of the games. I played some of it on an actual like Neo Geo, and it was mostly just the fighting games because that's what a lot of SNK stuff is. Just, you know, King of Fighters, Fatal Fury.
And fighting games were really popular in arcades in the 90s too, so it wasn't hard to find them.
Yeah, so but I did get to test one, and they are really cool. They are cool systems. But because fighting games are not like my thing, it's like it's not something I would ever like go out of my way to actually purchase.
Right.
Except I would buy one over 2 PS5s. 2 PS5 Pros.
Yeah. I'll say, so like, I definitely don't have a whole lot of experience with the actual home console. I think I did play a few of the arcade cabinets under the Neo Geo series.
You probably did.
They were actually in quite a lot of places. Like I'm sure. I think there was like a shoot 'em up that I played that I don't remember the name of. That was one. I definitely played King of Fighters or Fatal Fury, one of those two at some point. And I mean, there's some other iconic games. I didn't play all of them, but like, yeah, Neo Geo had a library. SNK had a library to back themselves up. So that's a pretty good thing. Jack, did you have any experience with Neo Geo?
No, not really.
Not the games either.
I mean, I think I've played a little bit of King of Fighters, but like that's it.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll do the handhelds next, and then we'll go to a quit, and then we'll do a break after the handhelds because we'll be able to talk about a lot more stuff after that. Going to the handhelds, we got 3 major ones. The first one of those we're going to talk about, and actually released first, is the Nintendo Game Boy, which was originally released in North America on July 31st, 1989. And it now, as I mentioned in the, I think I mentioned this in the previous time we did a console wars with the Game Boy Color, but they are combined for the purposes of sales, and their sales figures total 116.89 million units. So it is one of the best selling systems of all time. I don't know how much of
the true king of this generation.
I don't know how much of those are the original Game Boy, but it's still a substantial amount. Like it is like at least like SNES sales for just the original model, if I remember correctly. I think we're still talking about like a good 50-ish million off of just the original Game Boy. So we're not like, even if you took out the Game Boy Color entirely, Landon's not wrong to say, as far as sales, this is still the king of the generation. But it had a bunch of different models released for it. Speaking of which, besides the Game Boy Color, you also had the Game Boy Pocket. You also had a Japan exclusive Game Boy Light. They also had like a special release series of like colored Game Boy units, because originally it was just like the same like gray one. They came out with like different colors. They called it Play It Loud. So like you had a few different releases for this guy. But as far as games for this thing, God, where do we start? I mean, we mentioned the first generation Pokemon games. You've got Super Mario Land, you got Tetris, you got Kirby's Dream Land, Kirby's Dream Land 2, Kirby's Pinball Land, you got Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, you got Donkey Kong 94. There's actually like a series of Mega Man games specifically for the Game Boy, and the further into that series you go, the less connected to the NES games they are. So they're actually becoming like their own like specific devoted games for the system. And I mean, we could go on all day. There's a lot of Game Boy games out there. A hell of a lot.
Tons.
One might say too many.
But I wouldn't.
Perhaps.
Cloud would not. On record.
I would not.
Too many.
There's not too many games for Game Boy. But someone else could say, yeah. What would you say is like one of your first experiences with the Game Boy? Because I think this is like a really special system for all of us, at least Landon and myself. Jack, not so much.
I was going to say this is another like
I have one thing I forgot to mention.
This is another like case of like I'm too young to have like really had the Game Boy. I mean, I guess I wasn't necessarily, but like again, I've told this story a million times, but first console was the GBA. I got that in 2001.
Yeah.
So
Jack, are you even a gamer?
I guess not, honestly.
I will say one thing I never really brought up. One of my earliest experiences playing a Game Boy game outside of Pokemon and outside of the Smurfs was actually my sister had Paperboy for the Game Boy. And I believe the first Paperboy was like a much older game, but they put it on the Game Boy, and I remember just playing that a lot. Like I don't know what it is. It was just fun to just like, you had this isometric view and you went down the street in a bike and you tossed the newspapers, and sometimes there was weird obstacles in the street, like a dog or a police car that's trying to pull somebody over, or a like log or telephone pole that fell over in the it was weird, but it was nice. It was just like it showed that the Game Boy was capable of like different perspectives for games and could still pull them off, because the Game Boy was supposed to be like your portable NES sort of thing. So a lot of the games are kind of trying to be that, but they learned really quick to actually just make games for the system later on.
I mean, there is a lot of games that are, yes, NES ports, and then there's a lot of
or just like so much as like games that feel like they could be NES games if they were released for like a home console, but not specifically NES ports.
But like one I really enjoy actually, that also had an NES version is Yoshi. It's one of those drop puzzle games where you are trying to like create a Yoshi egg and try to sandwich in a bunch of Mario enemies. And that had both an NES and a Game Boy version. I think both versions are like solid. So that one's a good example of like actually bringing an NES game over to the Game Boy and it working.
I think one strength about the Game Boy when it comes to block puzzles is because Tetris was a pack-in title for it. It opened up a lot of people to wanting to play games similar to it. So you'd have stuff like Yoshi. I believe there was a Game Boy version of Dr. Mario, which is basically the same thing almost as Yoshi. And I mean, there's other games like it. You had Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, which was for Game Boy Color, but still, it was pretty popular to release those kind of games on the Game Boy.
And then I wrote out some games that I really liked for the Game Boy. Some of them you mentioned, your Donkey Kong, the Donkey Kong 94. There was also the Donkey Kong Land games, which were basically just Donkey Kong Country, but for the Game Boy Color.
One thing really weirded me out, so like Donkey Kong Land is actually a Game Boy game, but we would also eventually end up getting for the Game Boy Color Donkey Kong Country.
Yeah. It's like weird. They did this like both. You could basically have Donkey Kong Country in two different flavors.
Is it basically the same game? It just has the color support? Or is there like a difference?
I think it's pretty much, if I remember right, the levels are like very close. It is definitely crunched down and everything, but it is like Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color is like the Super Nintendo game, essentially. And the Donkey Kong Land games are more original. They're just using similar sprites.
That's why they look the same, but they're not the same actually gameplay wise.
Yes, because they use like similar sprites. They use like basically the template of Donkey Kong Country on Donkey Kong Land.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, they're more original. So there was those Kirby's Dream Land 1 and 2. Like Kirby's Dream Land is one of like I feel like a top 5 iconic in terms of like just like how iconic it is. Like Kirby's Dream Land 1 is like one of those games that is just it is there. You have Link's Awakening, the original version was Game Boy, and then they did the director's cut for Game Boy Color. But like the original version still is solid. You just don't get the color dungeon, but otherwise the core game is there for the Link's Awakening. Solid Zelda game.
Yeah, especially as far as like Game Boy games are concerned. Like that's a beefy game.
It is. It's great. So Metroid 2, Return of Samus is a surprisingly well-made take on the Metroidvania style game, even though it's far more linear than its two brothers, Metroid and Super Metroid. But that does come with the hardware, but like it makes Samus's like iconic suit design with the shoulder pads. She's a football player now in this game. Some more out there ones. Cat Trap, and Mole Mania are two really fun puzzle games. Mole Mania was, I think, one of the early titles that Iwata worked on, if I remember right, or it was
Shigeru
Miyamoto. Right. It was one of those like it was like it's a Nintendo puzzle game that you play as a mole. It's a lot of fun. And then two third-party games that I absolutely adore. Gargoyle's Quest and The Sword of Hope 2.
Yep.
Yeah, like I've talked about those games before. I streamed Gargoyle's Quest earlier, and that game it's a fun adventure game, and then Sword of Hope 2 is a fantastic first-person RPG for the Game Boy.
Okay. And then we're going to talk about next the rival to the Game Boy, quote-unquote rival, when it comes to sales. But you did have Sega step in, and they were like, hey, we're going to make our own handheld too. So they came out with the Sega Game Gear, released in North America originally in April 1991. It did sell only 10.62 million units worldwide, though, considering the competition, not too bad. I mean, it's probably somewhere closer to the middle out of everything we're talking about tonight. So, it notably, something that the original Game Boy did not have was a full color screen. And because of that, it also ate batteries up like a motherfucker, notoriously. So that's cool.
It required 6 batteries versus the 2 batteries that your Game Boy required.
Game Boy Color. The Game Boy original did take 4.
That's true. But yeah.
But still,
it's still like more batteries.
And to be fair, those 4 batteries for the Game Boy usually got you about 30, 40 hours of playtime. Game Gear, you were lucky to get 10.
You were mostly getting about 6.
Yeah.
Let's be like 6 was a good average. You could squeeze out 10 if you like turn down
everything.
Yeah, but like yeah.
But the Game Gear does have an interesting library. I did note here in my notes, it has a weird quirk with its library, so there are some exclusives, but it also was known for having a lot of ports of NES and Master System games, and some Master System games actually just released at the same time or around the same window as the Game Gear. So it was effectively the same game, just crunched down to fit on the Game Gear with no other changes. So it had quite a few games that did this too. But you've got some games like the various Sonic games that were on the Game Gear. The earlier ones were also Master System releases. There's there's a couple games in the GG Shinobi, which was Game Gear Shinobi. You've got Shining Force 2, The Sword of Haja, Defenders of Oasis. There's a bunch of other games. I actually want to throw this to Landon. I assume, Jack, you don't really have any experience with Game Gear besides whatever was on those Sonic collections.
Yeah, it's mostly just the games that were on Sonic collections, honestly.
Same here,
and,
brother.
Some of those are good games.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they're not, but I just no firsthand experience with the Game Gear aside from holding Landon's Game Gear one time.
Not Landon's, but I did hold someone else's Game Gear one time, and that is all my experience with it. So yeah, let's just hear from Landon. He's got his Game Gear with him. Tell us about the Game Gear.
The Game Gear sucks.
What y'all motherfuckers know about the Game Gear?
That's it. It kind of sucks.
But you love it.
I do love it. So I would say the strengths for the like system, for this system in terms of library are like a lot of like, because it had like more competent ports like of like a console, like home console version to the Game Gear, like worked better than like the Game Boy, just because the hardware was like slightly better and it had the color palette. It has like, I don't know, a little bit of variety from what I like actually enjoy. There's like some shmups that I really enjoy on this. Aerial Assault and Haley Wars are 2 really fantastic shmups. You had like versions of Mortal Kombat, Shaq Fu, Fatal Fury Special on the Game Gear. And Fatal Fury Special, like the animations of the Game Gear version are surprisingly well done for like an 8-bit handheld system comparatively to like when you look at it from the lens of like the 16-bit game.
Now I imagine
systems.
I imagine that the games are a little compromised on the Game Gear because of the limited buttons.
Yes. So that is one thing. You have more simplistic games for these, like, because you only have the 2 buttons. Like, there's only so much you can do, especially for fighting games. But they're still like very, very enjoyable. I remember playing several rounds of Fatal Fury Special with a friend, and still had a really great time on that.
Yeah.
And
And
then
that said,
they
I
had
mean,
like columns. Oh yeah, go ahead.
the fighting games were at least more competent than the Game Boy ones, because the Game Boy had the same problem, only 2 buttons, but generally the fighting games on the Game Boy are usually not considered to have good animation.
No,
Not very good. So
no. And then yeah, you had like more Tetris competition. I know columns is like it's the closest thing you get on like the Genesis and Game Gear as far as like a Tetris. Like
yeah, and as far as
I
stuff
mean,
like we got out here, obviously you had Puyo Puyo, and there is like stuff like that on the Game Gear, but like it's like Japan only. So
you did get and Mean Bean Machine is on both as well.
right.
And so you did get Mean Bean Machine out west. So you did get a Puyo Puyo, but like Puyo Puyo 2 is like Game Gear is like Japan exclusive. And then you mentioned a couple of them. Crystal Warriors, Defenders of Oasis, Dragon Crystal, and then Shining Force, all really solid like RPGs for the system. Dragon Crystal is like a really fun roguelike game that was like well before. Like it's very much like a dungeon mystery dungeon game.
Oh, okay.
Like
That's pretty interesting to have on like a
roguelike.
portable.
Yeah, and it works pretty surprisingly well. Yeah, I do enjoy the Game Gear quite a bit, but let's be real, it's fine at best.
Yeah,
You have to plug it into a wall in order
but
it to be like to be able to play a game.
we can rest assured knowing that at least the Game Gear was able to outperform the last main handheld we're going to talk about in this section before we go to our housekeeping break, and that is the Atari Lynx. The Atari Lynx was released in North America actually well before the Game Gear. It was shortly after the Game Boy. Came out in North America on September 1st, 1989.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, did you have like some epiphany about the Lynx or something?
No, I just think it's funny how like Atari like they had 2 naming schemes for their consoles. It was numbers and then it was cats.
Yep. It was basically just that. It sold about an estimated 2 million units worldwide, which considering the Atari was already in steep decline, I guess 2 million's not that bad. It was one of their last pieces of hardware though, before just completely folding out of the hardware manufacturing business. It was basically this, the Jaguar, then they were done. So, but there was a few notable games for the Atari Lynx, and I'm not making this up. These are the names of these games. There is California Games, which is like a series of like games that are like, you know, set in California, so like surfing and other shit like that. You had Awesome Golf, which apparently is an actually good golf game for the system. A game called Rampart, which I think is supposed to be like a shooter or something. And Chips Challenge, which is like supposed to be like an action or adventure type of title. Atari also, the Lynx had like this weird thing where like a few very late release games, including some that came out after the Atari Lynx was even supported, had like this thing where like you would rotate the system because it had like a Game Boy Advance type of like horizontal layout. You had the directional buttons, you'd have the face buttons, and then the screen was actually in the middle. So it was closer to like the Game Gear and not quite the Game Boy where like the screen was in a different spot orientation wise. But because of how the buttons were placed, like you could actually make some games that like the screen would be accounted for rotating 90 degrees, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, the Atari Lynx, I've never used this in my life.
Me neither.
This is a fake.
I barely knew it existed, to be honest.
This is a fake handheld.
It's I mean, when you're selling not even remotely close to the Game Gear, which is like
not even remotely close to the Game Boy.
Yeah, like why are we talking about you?
So like if I lowball and I say that like the original Game Boy was around that 50 million unit threshold, the Atari Lynx only sold a fifth of the Game Gear, and the Game Gear had already only sold a fifth of the Game Boy.
It's ridiculous that this thing like went to market.
Yeah. But to be fair, it did come out super early. The main problem with the Atari Lynx was not only was it from Atari, but they also, as soon as they were like planning to come out with the Jaguar, they pulled like a PlayStation Vita back in the early 90s and said, oh, this handheld, we're not supporting it anymore. We're not doing anything with it anymore. Got to focus on the new system, baby. And that is exactly the same thing that happened with Sony with the Vita. And then they were like, oh, we got the PS4 now. What's a Vita? We don't know what Vita games are. And they just didn't support it afterwards. So same thing.
I mean, at least Sony came out with like
something.
Like they
the
like,
Atari was worse.
No,
Atari was worse though. Yeah.
Atari was much worse in terms of like just dropping like actual support. Like sometimes Sony would remember it existed.
Yeah. No, Atari basically just completely ignored the Lynx in favor of the Jaguar. Probably part of the reason they failed. But we have a few more pieces of hardware to get to. But before that, let us do a little bit of housekeeping. We'll take a little bit of a break from the discussion. Jack, to give me just a little bit of a throat, can you just tell the gang what we're doing on Twitch? Because I don't remember.
Right now we're not doing anything actually. We just finished Spookfest last week. And you know, we finished up Night in the Woods and The Quarry, and all of those VODs are on YouTube already, so you know, you can go watch those if you missed out on them. As far as like streams right now, we don't have anything because we decided to take the week off. Landon said that his next stream is going to be Dragon Quest 3, but that won't be until that game comes out, which is the 15th, I think. Yeah.
So it's
and
later.
He's going to be playing that on the 16th. For me though, I haven't 100% decided on what I'm doing next, but I'm fairly certain it's going to be Ace Attorney Dual Destinies.
Okay.
Because it's been a minute since we've done an Ace Attorney, and I think it's about time to do one. But yeah. Okay. That's pretty much it right now.
I actually am going to be doing a couple streams the next couple of days after the live of this podcast. By the time this goes out to other platforms, I'll already have done those streams. Yeah. I've kind of decided on what game I want to do, but I'm not going to reveal what it is.
Yeah, I just realized if for the podcast listening audience, you'll already know what I'm playing by then.
But I've basically decided what I want to play tomorrow and the day after. I'm hoping I can beat it in those two streams, but if I can't, I'll probably throw a third stream up. But it's a short game, so I'm looking forward to playing it because it's the first time that we'll be playing, that anybody on our channel will be covering this game. So
okay,
it'll be a nice thing to add in there. But anyway, we also have, we somehow still have a Twitter. We should probably be using some.
Do we need to use that, honestly?
No, we never actually use it, but it's there.
No, we don't.
I guess we should probably be branching out into some other social media sites in the future. But we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/GamingStooges. That has been popping off with a bunch of good content on the gold tier Stooge level. We've got a lot of cool backlogged content that you can enjoy. We've been doing Delta Green campaign, which is finally wrapping up pretty soon. And we've got some plans for some future Patreon exclusive stuff that's going to be coming up as well. We've also been doing polls. By the time this goes out, there should be a poll for a couple upcoming podcast episodes. So make sure to check that out. We'll have that in our Discord, which you can join in the link in the descriptions for any of these episodes as well. Landon, did you want to say anything else about housekeeping stuff as far as like Patreon stuff or Twitch plans. Jack mentioned what you were going to be doing next, which is going to be a little while.
It's gonna be like
next
a week
week.
and a half.
Yeah, next week. It should be like next week should be starting Dragon Quest 3.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but like I mean, like a week and a half from today.
Today when we're recording it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Next Saturday we'll be starting Dragon Quest 3 2D HD or HD 2D, however they say it. I don't know. So that'll be fun and exciting.
Lennon, do you have a Tillamook product to promote?
I am going to eat a slice of Tillamook whole milk mozzarella.
Right in front of us.
I have ice cream.
Ooh, chocolate peanut butter.
Because
Classic.
I don't have a lot. Unfortunately, all of the Tillamook options I have are classics because that's pretty much all we get out here. It is a good one though. I'm not saying it's not.
I really enjoy the chocolate peanut butter.
No, it's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, I've already eaten like half of it, so.
All right.
Just dangling the cheese in front of the viewers.
So let's get back to talking about the last few pieces of hardware. And if you'll remember at the beginning of the episode, I mostly mentioned, and by the way, going forward, you probably have heard it, but I want to apologize. My voice is kind of like really raspy today. It's been a rough day and my throat's not really like in good shape today. So I'm trying to do my best, but, these last few pieces of hardware are not traditional, like orthodox hardware, but they are cornerstones of this generation, so I do want to go through them real quick. First one is kind of the least important. You've got the NEC Turbo Express, which, as I mentioned, is just a portable version of the NEC TurboGrafx 16 console, specifically the pre-CD version of it, because like I said, there was a later edition that could also play the CD-ROM based TurboGrafx games. Well, the Turbo Express can only play the cards, but it was a portable version of that, and it released in December of 1990 in North America. I mean, if the TurboGrafx 16 was already not super popular outside of Japan, I think there might have been some support in some European countries, but as far as North America, that was a niche as fuck product already, and the Turbo Express is even more niche than that, so thumbs up. The next system, though, is not system. Piece of hardware is that I have listed is the Sega CD or the Sega Mega CD, and this actually fared decently well for what it was. It was a CD-ROM based add-on to the Genesis / Mega Drive, and it had the ability to play CD-based games. Now, specifically, it only attached to the two models of Genesis that Sega produced. Because as we had mentioned before, Tectoy and Majesco, they had their own versions of the Sega Genesis that came out later. Those do not have support for the Sega CD. And it is the, of like the CD-based add-on hardware, this is the only one I actually have listed, but there was also an NEC TurboGrafx CD-ROM add-on that was then molded into later releases of the TurboGrafx, so it would just be the PC Engine plus the CD-ROM add-on. But that was sold separately as just like a peripheral that did that, so that was pretty interesting. But the Sega CD was released on October 15th, 1992, and it actually sold a little over 2.5 million, estimated 2.7 million units worldwide. And there were some notable games. We talked about a few of those earlier when we talked about the ESRB thing, because Night Trap is one of those Sega CD games. But on top of that, you also had Sonic CD and
garbage.
A very notable game that was exclusive to the CD for a while, Lunar the Silver Star, which was an RPG exclusive originally for the CD and then was moved to some other hardware and like collections and stuff and remakes and stuff later on.
You guys gonna get the Lunar Star collection?
I'm interested in it. I got to look back into it, but when I saw it and it was like first announced, I was like, "Ooh, I like that." So
I'm gonna piss my pants.
You're gonna piss
Hell
your
yeah.
pants for it.
No, just separate.
Just it's all separate then. Okay.
To piss my pants.
Did any of you guys have experience with the Sega CD outside of Sonic CD?
No.
No. No, I don't own I do actually own a Genesis. I don't own a CD,
unfortunately,
for it.
And then the last piece of hardware we're going to talk about. This one's Landon's favorite. This might be the reason why he's actually about to piss himself.
Yes.
We got the Philips CDI, which
I'm gonna shit myself now.
Which is the CD-ROM based hardware that, as I mentioned, was not marketed specifically as a game console. It was supposed to be a multimedia system that like played interactive CDs. They just happened to have a lot of them that were really just closer to what you would consider video games. Now, there is a dispute over the exact sales figures for this hardware. Philips claims in 1994 that they had 1 million install base. But the Wall Street Journal reported in 1996 they only found sales of 400,000 units. So we don't know what the exact sales are. On the low end, it's less than 500,000, but on the high side, we could say it's 1 million if Philips says so.
I'm gonna go with probably half of what the Wall Street Journal.
Possibly.
I mean, I'm more inclined to believe the Wall Street Journal than fucking Philips.
Yep.
In this case,
the Philips CDI is known for having quote unquote games, such as some based on Nintendo's own Mario and Legend of Zelda franchises, because they somehow were able to wrestle some rights to make a few games for the hardware from Nintendo.
Honestly insane that they did.
Yeah. They are not well regarded by anyone
at all,
by any metric.
No, unless you're the YouTube poop community, in which case these are the greatest games to ever exist.
Exactly. And there's also the much memed Flowers of Robert Mapplethorpe, which is literally just a gallery of pictures of flowers from a guy named Robert Mapplethorpe.
What a name.
Yeah. I think there's also, I think Plumbers Don't Wear Ties was also on this.
Yup.
Yeah.
So it's a very weird piece of hardware.
People like to complain about certain games in like more recent generations, like Uncharted and like the Supermassive games, for being more movie than video game. When you look at the Philips CDI, I don't think that's true. I think those are
like, we need context.
The definition of movie video games.
Yeah, we definitely need more context. The CDI was known for that, and when it tried to do anything more, you got shit like the Zelda CDI games. So, I think Dragon's Lair, which was originally a PC game, was also released on this.
Yes.
So
I think it had a
Sega CD release as well. Yeah, I think it was put on like any of like the systems that could support that medium, because it was originally in 1982.
I just want to say, I do have experience with the CDI.
Do tell.
Not a lot.
Out of all of the systems for this generation.
No, not when it came out.
Fake Gamer Jack has...
He's the biggest defender of the CDI. He gets to defend the CDI at the end.
All right, Jack. What's your experience? What's your experience with the Philips CDI?
Literally, I have a friend who owns a CDI just because of the memes, and he bought Hotel Mario and both of the Link the Faces of Evil and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. And I have played each game for about 20 minutes apiece, and they are all awful.
You know what? I'll go on record. You're more of a gamer than I am. Fake Gamer Jack and Faker Gamer Landon.
That's us. The fake gaming stooges.
I can be the ungamer. I'm not even a fake. I'm just the reverse of a gamer.
The only gamer.
The only gamer.
I know this didn't release in the West, but I do want to briefly mention the Satellaview for the Super Famicom.
Yep.
Because it is a very interesting piece of hardware where you would be able to download video games from the internet in Japan, and like there was some like Super Famicom games that like only came out through that, including a couple Zelda games. Some of them were just literally rips of Link to the Past, but they did have, I think, one original release for it as well for Zelda. But there was like ones where you could literally just play A Link to the Past with an avatar character instead, because like it had like a whole like hub where like all the menus that you went to was like in a like cityscape, and like you made an avatar and walked around it. It's a cool piece of hardware and technology, especially for like the 90s where like the internet was very much a newer thing.
Oh.
Yeah.
I do want to bring up a few things that I did not bring up that are on the Wikipedia page here. We had the Sega Pico, which was an edutainment system. That was interesting. And
that's my favorite system.
I think the best named handheld system of all time was released specifically for Hong Kong's market. It was called two different names. There was the Mega Duck and the Cougar Boy.
I'm sorry, the what?
The Mega Duck and the Cougar Boy. Yes, these are both the name of a system that was sold specifically for the Hong Kong market in that period.
Is this supposed to be like an Atari ripoff because it's a Cougar Boy?
I think so.
Yes.
Or like a Game Boy ripoff, or like what?
This is I was going to say this is Atari's take on a handheld system, but I forgot that that we talked about Atari's handheld system not even 15 minutes ago.
So the actually, I believe, fun fact, if I can go back in my notes just a quick second. Where did I have it? I know I had it somewhere. Okay, never mind. I thought it was the same group, but they're not the same group. But the group that made the Mega Duck are called Wellback Holdings. Okay, so it wasn't for Hong Kong, but it was made in Hong Kong. And then it was released in like certain territories. Did not do anything special though, obviously. I just thought it had a cool name.
Did it sell more than the Atari Jaguar?
There's literally
or whatever we talked about.
There's literally no sales figures for it, so probably not.
Well, I choose to believe it did.
Okay. Yeah, those are the only things I wanted to like bring up, just because I thought they were funny. That's as far as hardware goes. So, a few questions. This is probably going to be an obvious answer for each of you, but what would you say is your favorite hardware from this generation?
Super Nintendo.
Super Nintendo?
Yeah.
For me, I'm actually torn. It's tough. I have a lot of nostalgia, and I actually probably had more specific use with the Genesis. Although I played more of the Super Nintendo's library, some of that was like later releases of games for it. So I don't have the nostalgia of playing with the actual hardware as much as the Genesis. But I still really like the Super Nintendo, and I think it has the better library. So it's tough. If I'm picking based on nostalgia, I'm picking Genesis. But if I'm picking based on overall experience, it's going to be Super Nintendo. So the tough for me. I'm going to be the middle guy.
There's a lot for the console games that I really like. I mean, notably, Super Metroid and Chrono Trigger are two of my like favorite games of all time. So, like, if we're going based off of just that, it's probably the Super Nintendo. But I think I want to say it's honestly the Game Boy, like overall.
Yeah, that's probably my
as
third. So it's a good one.
like that. It's probably that, and then it becomes a close toss up between the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. And then, I mean, I love the Game Gear. But like the hardware itself is dog and shit. Is just like, I mean,
Yeah.
as far as like the battery goes, and then like it was very easy to damage the speakers on those, and the screen wasn't great. I mean, but on the Game Boy, the screens are not great. You don't
Yeah.
get a good portable screen until I mean, outside of like, as far as like the main like Sega versus Nintendo, you don't really get a good screen until the Game Boy Advance SP. Let's be real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, as far as like mileage goes, like you get a lot of mileage out of the Game Boy, and the Game Gear, you don't get as much mileage out in terms of just like raw playtime, unless you plug it into a wall, and then at that point, what's the point?
Yeah. I want to ask, and this is going to probably be like the biggest question before we get into our usual fun bit at the end, but what are some iconic games and franchises that resonated with you from this generation? There's probably a lot. I would definitely say, as far as like, so for me, it's going to definitely be between just Game Boy, Genesis, Super Nintendo. For Game Boy, obviously Pokemon, the first generation games there, Kirby's Dream Land, Kirby's Pinball Land, Kirby's Dream Land 2. Those are all really big for me. Super Mario Land, to a lesser extent, Super Mario Land 2 is really good. That's like the core for me as far as Game Boy games. I've played others, but those are like the big ones. Super Nintendo, really hard to pin down. If I'm picking just based on what I played when I had the hardware originally, it would probably be Super Mario World, Killer Instinct, and Super Mario Kart, probably. But I mean, Donkey Kong Country was up there as well. I also played Mortal Kombat quite a lot on that one. So like there's quite a lot of stuff on there that's really good. But as far as like stuff I played at the time, like those are the bigger ones. Genesis, as far as stuff I played at the time, that would be what I mentioned already. You got the you got the original Sonic games, sans Sonic 3. I did not play Sonic 3 originally. I only got to play Sonic and Knuckles, and then Sonic 1 and 2, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, Vector Man 1 specifically I played more of, and Toy Story was like a big one. I played the Genesis version of that a lot. So, yeah, I mean, I've got I could go on forever. Like, I mean, I love Final Fantasy 4 and Final Fantasy 6, especially now that I've played them, but I didn't play them on the Super Nintendo originally. And, I mean, Chrono Trigger is one of the best games of all time, but I never played it originally on the Super Nintendo. I've always played re-releases, so. But it's still a big game. Oh, and one game I wanted to mention for the Super Nintendo that I mentioned in our previous podcast, EVO Search for Eden. That's a good game. It's a good game. Yeah, I think that covers all the games I want to mention. Just kind of like to throw some out there. Jack, did you manage to think of a bunch? Or do you want Landon to go first so you have more time?
I mean, am I only supposed to pick games that I played on original hardware? Because
I mean,
like
I did just because
not
like
be very many.
I mean, I did just because, but like if you just wanted to go with like whatever the first games you played that were from those systems, regardless of whether you had the hardware.
I was going to say, like, I think the Super Nintendo holds like my personal record for most games played not on original hardware.
Yeah, I think that's the same case for a lot of people, to be honest.
I own a Super Nintendo, and I have probably like 7 or 8 cartridges, but like most of my experience with the Super Nintendo has been through emulation, virtual console, collection re-releases, Nintendo Switch Online, etc. But I mean, in terms of like my favorite games from the era, I mean, obviously Sonic 3 and Knuckles is my favorite game. Any of the Sonic Genesis games are applicable. As far as like Super Nintendo goes, like Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite games of all time. Mario World, Kirby Superstar, the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, Super Metroid. I mean, I feel like I'm just naming like the games everyone names when they say, "What are your favorite Super Nintendo games?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, these ones." It's the ones you expect.
Yeah, that's
because
fair.
I'm not a real gamer.
I mean, if we're going based off of it's Pokemon and Sonic that are like the most influential franchises to like stuff that I like still kind of care about today. One day I will play a Pokemon game, specifically Scarlet and Violet. But I'm going to spend the rest of my time to call out something for Al. Al's our guy in the chat. He's always there. And while I not been able to play them personally, there was Fire Emblem games that released on in Japan, and here's 2 of the 3 of them.
Nice.
I'm missing one. They are solid ones. And then I don't usually care for player's choice like versions of games, even though like half of my GameCube collection is player's choice, because at the time you're going to get what you get. But I really think the Metroid 1, and I don't know why I brought this out because this isn't even this console generation, but
Yeah.
Metroid.
Not.
Okay.
Yeah, I just realized that as I was talking about it, and
You're like, wait a minute.
after I grabbed it and everything. So there we go. I was like,
good job, Landon.
We're talking about that generation, right?
All right.
No.
So I've got one last question that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to do our usual bit. But before that, I did not do this during our housekeeping, so I do want to mention just a quick thank you to everybody that's been tuning into our podcast, and obviously a big thank you to all of our subscribed patrons, especially at our gold Stooge tier. Always fuck that.
There you go.
We got Pixel Vixen as per usual. We want to give an extra special shout out to her. Now, last question I want to ask before we do our little debate. Is there anything from this generation that you haven't really experienced that you would like to get to? Like on your bucket list, to-do list? Be it games or full-on hardware. Maybe.
Wait, sorry, what was the question? I didn't quite hear you.
If there's any games, hardware, franchises that are from this generation that you have like on a bucket list that you haven't gotten to that you'd like to get to.
Oh, okay. Landon's got a book.
I turned directly to this page.
Intentionally or not?
Not intentionally. I just opened this book and it just, Paper Mario, baby.
It knew. Not relevant to this podcast, but
once again, has nothing to do with this shit.
Paper Mario.
Paper Mario, baby. Go ahead.
That is a good question, honestly. I think there's a lot of like Genesis games that I would like to have more experience with. Nothing specific coming to mind. Like I never really played Golden Axe. There's, I mean, probably
We should play Golden Axe. Like,
should.
yeah,
Why not?
that'd be an easy one that we can, because Golden Axe is a lot of fun. Same with Streets of Rage. I don't know. Have you played much of Streets of Rage?
The original game, not that I can.
I know I played
Remember.
one of them, but I don't know which one.
Did you play Streets of Rage 2?
I've definitely played a little bit of Streets of Rage 2.
Okay. Have you played the Genesis or the Game Gear versions of those?
No.
He's like,
are they bad?
He's like, we're gonna play those.
Surprisingly, no. They're fairly confident. I mean, it's a beat 'em up.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, you just need to move and punch and kick. That's it.
Pretty much.
But yeah, anything else?
I'm trying to think of like one specific one off the top of my head, like one that I've really been wanting to play, but just never really got around to it. I don't know. I mean, I guess like the Dragon Quest games, I don't really have any experience with. On the Super Nintendo.
Okay.
Hold on, I'm like skimming the best-selling games on the Super Nintendo.
All right. Well, I can name some stuff off if you wanted to just kind of get a few more things.
Go.
So as far as for me, it's three major things. I really want to actually try to start looking into PC Engine or Neo Geo games, because as I've seen, there is some decent, good quality games that are just on stuff I've never played, so I've never had the chance to play them. Nothing specific, but I mean, I'm sure there's stuff I would be able to find if I did some digging and some research. For Genesis games, I'm kind of already doing that. I've been playing some of the Phantasy Star titles. I played through 4. I started 3, although I didn't get very far, and I'm about to start Phantasy Star 2 in the near future. I do want to try and play the Shining Force games. I've played Golden Axe. I've played Streets of Rage. I've played Vector Man. I played Ristar. Ristar is one of my favorite games on the system. So I played a lot of Genesis games that I probably want to play, although I'm sure I could find more if I looked. As far as Super Nintendo, there's still quite a bit. I want to play Secret of Mana. I want to play the Breath of Fire games that were on this system. I started one of them. I can't remember which one it was. It was the Game Boy Advance port of it, and I fucking loved the shit out of that game. So I want to get back to whichever one that was. I want to say it might have been 2, but I can't remember. But yeah, Breath of Fire is a big series that I want to get into. I've managed to just recently play through Final Fantasy VI for the first time, and I now think it's one of the greatest games of all time. So like, I've been kicking stuff off the bucket list from this era pretty reliably, honestly. So I can't say there's too much left that I really want to get into, but I'll find stuff eventually that I want to. I mean, I'm playing through Final Fantasy Mystic Quest right now, so like, I'm finding shit. As far as portable things, I do want to eventually play more Game Gear games. As Landon was saying, I mean, there's competent ports of actual, at the time, home console games on the Game Gear, just because the power of the screen was way better than the Game Boy Color, or the Game Boy at least. So you were able to do more with that. And Game Boy games, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of good Game Boy games, but I've kind of played all the ones I really want to play. I mean, there's a couple I want to get to. We talked about Donkey Kong 94 at some point, so like, that's something.
I would say that and the Sword of Hope 2. I feel like the Sword of Hope 2 would be an RPG that you would actually enjoy.
Maybe. I definitely liked what I saw when you were playing Gargoyle's Quest.
Gargoyle's Quest is excellent. So, like, if I had to make 3 Game Boy recommendations to people that is not just your typical, like, I guess 2 Game Boy recommendations that are just not your typical, like, Nintendo stuff is Gargoyle's Quest and the Sword of Hope 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now, going back, Jack, did you have more stuff that you could think of for your bucket list?
I mean, not really. I mean, I look through there's a lot of stuff I'd like to revisit. You know what? Okay, I will say Secret of Mana I've never played all the way through, and I would like to one day.
Oh, I gotta finish Earthbound. I was playing through that and I never finished it.
Earthbound is a fucking classic.
I've heard.
That is a game that is worth seeing through to the end for sure. It gets fucky. Not just because of Gygas, but it gets fucky at the end.
All right. I will say, Katie reminded me of Crusader of Senti. I did want to bring that up when we were talking about Genesis games. I forgot to, but that is a fun, Zelda style game that is on the Genesis. That's a pretty good one. If you were a Genesis ride or die, you still had a game in that type of genre to play. But yeah, I mean, Jack, you've always come off as a polygon boy.
I just grew up in that era. I mean, I love the Super Nintendo, believe me. I love the 16-bit era of video games. This shit rules. I mean, all of these games, a lot of games of this era have aged super, super well. And I'm the fucking hasn't aged the best guy.
Yeah.
This generation is the opposite of that. I mean, at least when it comes to first party titles on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, still play pretty perfectly to this day.
Oh yeah, a lot of these hold up incredibly well today. They're still competent games that you can have a lot of fun with.
Literally the only thing that I can think of that has not aged very well is some Super Nintendo games have a lot of slowdown.
I guess
which can be annoying, but it's not a deal breaker for me.
I would say that's less of a problem with the hardware and just those specific games not being optimized well for Super Nintendo. I would say I think the one Achilles heel for me personally was early fighting games on the Genesis, because there was only 3 buttons on that shit, A, B, and C. So if you had an intricate fighting system to the game, 3 buttons was not quite a lot. So until they came out with the 6-button controller, so you had A, B, Z, X, Y, Z, it was kind of tough to do really, really intricate fighting games on that. So I know Street Fighter 2 is a game that suffered for that until the Genesis got that extra controller to get the extra buttons in there. So I think that's really the only big problem I have is that. But that said, it's not it's a deal breaker. A lot of games still work fine. I mean, a lot of people still played Mortal Kombat 1 with no problems on the Genesis. So it's not it's the be all end all, but it is something I noticed. But yeah, I mean, for you, Jack, specifically, it kind of helps that a lot of these would get re-releases on stuff like the Game Boy Advance, the DS, even the PSP would see some remakes or port collections for this era of games. You'd have a lot of stuff on the PS2, GameCube, Xbox that you could play from this generation. So it is a generation that gets a lot of love a lot of the time. Landon, do you have a bucket list of stuff you'd like to get to from this?
So yeah, Dragon Quest. This year I started playing a lot of the Dragon Quest games that I haven't, which is most of them. And so obviously Dragon Quest, was it 5 and 6 are the Super Famicom.
Yeah.
Super Famicom releases, and so those. And then I also want
was 4 on the NES, or was it on Super?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a Famicom release for 4. The first 4.
Okay.
Famicom. And then 7 was PlayStation.
Okay.
And then 8 was PlayStation 2.
Yeah. There's a bit of a gap between those ones.
Yeah. They crunched, but Dragon Quest was they just pumped the first 3 out and number 4, and then that's when after that, they sort of started to slow down a little bit.
Gotcha.
So yeah, those Dragon Quests, and then Shin Megami Tensei 2, I would like to try out at some point. That was a Super Famicom release originally. I want to play Live Alive, but I'm specifically probably going to play the Switch re-release of that. Because that was an official US release, let's be real.
Right.
But that's like, that release is like very much like an HD version of the Super Famicom release. So
yeah.
Oh well. There's those. There was I do want to at some point replay Final Fantasy VI, because I never actually beat that. I did get fairly far into it, and especially since the Pixel Remaster is out now, like, it's a pretty easy one to go back to and play through that version specifically. And then there is a Game Boy RPG I want to try out. Was it Greed something? I was just looking at it.
You'll have to share
I'd have to go back and double check it. Yeah, I think I've shared it before, but I'll share it again. Popful Mail was a Sega CD, and like it was really, but like
I saw that on some sorry. I saw that on some lists when I was like looking for like Sega CD titles.
Yeah, it's a action RPG that was done by Falcom.
Oh.
And yeah, so it's like, had an infamous rumor that the Sega CD version was supposed to have like Sonic's girlfriend or something as the playable character, but it was like not that, but like that was the rumor going around at the time. But Popful Mail is one that I do want to try out at some point. And then there is a Godzilla game for the Game Gear that is a tactical like game where you're trying to take out like the monsters. And then there's a Game Boy Godzilla game that I want to get at some. But those were both also Japan only.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It's time to do our typical thing that we do every console wars episode. Each of us is going to pick a console, and we're going to try to pitch it to you, the viewer, and try to get you to be swayed into siding with us. Now, the question is who is going to defend which system? As a reminder, the 4 home console ones that we got here are the TurboGrafx, the Genesis, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Neo Geo AES.
You're not including the CDI?
No, it's not actually. It doesn't fit like the same designation, so no. I mean, somehow the Neo Geo got in there, but it does have like a devoted thing. So now one of these is not going to get defended, unfortunately, because there's only 3 of us. But how do we want to decide this? Should we just do a die roll to see who gets to do first pick?
Yeah, fuck it.
All right. Do a D6 and do like mod 2. So like you're 1-2, I'm 3-4, Landon's 5-6.
Of course, the D6 was at the very bottom of this tube, so I have to take out all of them.
Go, man.
Okay, so what did you say the numbers were?
So you're 1-2, I'll be 3-4, Landon will be 5-6.
Okay, so rolling for Super Nintendo.
I was going to say rolling for first pick. Roll it for first pick.
Just roll
pick?
Yeah. Yeah, roll,
okay.
And then tell us who it is.
Okay, I rolled a 6.
All right, Landon, you get to pick
Perfect. Jack will get the Super Nintendo. That's my pick.
That's your choice? Okay.
That's my choice.
All right. I'm gonna roll a D4 now. Right. I'll be 1-2, you'll be 3-4. I got 2. Cloud, I choose you to have the Genesis.
All right, I got the Genesis. Jack has the Super Nintendo. Landon, I am going to give you the PC Engine.
Oh boy. This will go over
Your
well.
favorite.
All right. So, Jack, you are the first one. So pitch us the Super Nintendo.
Chrono Trigger. That's all you need.
That's it.
No, I mean, like, okay. Real. I'll be real. The Super Nintendo has like a crazy library of games, like one that many people to this day claim is like the best Nintendo library of all time for both first and third party. Like Nintendo's first party output was crazy, but like the third party titles from like Square and fucking Chunsoft, fucking, I mean not Chunsoft, but Enix, fucking Capcom, just a lot of like really good like I mean not collaborations, but like you have a lot of like companies contributing like really solid titles to the system. And like there are over 50 games on their list of best-selling games, which cuts off at games that sell over 1 million. I'm pretty sure anyway. But yeah, there's a lot of good ones. It's got a really good controller. The button layout on the Super Nintendo controller has been like the same on Nintendo consoles with I mean, ignore the GameCube and Wii, but like they come back to it. Ignore the 64 too. But like, you know, the classic like four-face button layout on the controller.
I would say not even just Nintendo, like that's a gaming thing at this point.
Well, yeah, but like, I mean, I was thinking like specifically like which specific button goes
ABXY.
where, but also, yeah, like four-face buttons is like has become the standard for like gaming controllers, and like the Super Nintendo was the first console to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Chrono Trigger.
So, Genesis, as you all know, does what Nintendo don't. We got some of the best arcade perfect ports of games. If you want your bite-sized action, we got those games with attitude like Sonic the Hedgehog and Vector Man, and some RoboCop game I mentioned halfway into the podcast that I'm pretty sure everybody here forgot, including me. You've got so many classic games that we just put on collections and we just sell them for like $30 every now and again. You get like 50 games. You don't even have to play the system. We're just giving these games away. So you could just experience these games over and over again, wherever you want, on whatever system you want, because we're Sega and we do that shit. But no, for real, we have a really strong library of systems. Now, we don't cover all the same genres to the same degree as the Super Nintendo, but as you could hear, we got a healthy amount of decent RPGs. We got some really good side-scrolling action for when it comes to action platforming games. We got great versions of sports games if you like to just sit down with your bros and chug some beers and play some, Genesis Madden or whatever shit you want to play. We've got, as I mentioned before, tons of really good arcade classics like shoot 'em ups, like stuff like side-scrolling beat 'em ups and run and guns like Gunstar Heroes and Streets of Rage and Golden Axe. So we're a really good system for a good variety of games, both single player, good multiplayer. We got you covered. Landon's looking at us like, I can't believe I have to do this.
Why am I here?
Because I thought it would be funny.
Hi, I'm here to talk about the TurboGrafx 16 and all the wonder and amazement that comes with playing the TurboGrafx 16. The TurboGrafx 16 has such great games as Splatterhouse.
He's just blue screened.
Yep.
He's just like, that's it. Just Splatterhouse.
It does. So the TurboGrafx 16 does have a lot of good shmups. If you like both vertical and horizontal shmups, like this system has like a great library of them. And then also like action RPGs. A lot of the Falcom games that were coming out on PCs at this time came out on the TurboGrafx. So Ys 1 through 4 is on this. You have Xanadu, and I think you definitely have versions of the first 2 Legend of Heroes games. Those don't have ties into the current like series, but like the original ones are there. SMT1 is on the TurboGrafx. So you have like other types of RPGs. Like we got some games.
Got to look a little harder, but the library's there. Got spunk.
Please buy me. Thanks.
All right, there you go. So who won this? Who do you think won this generation? You decide.
It was the Game Boy.
It was the Game Boy. The Game Boy.
I decided.
As far as like overall, yeah, the Game Boy dominated. As far as home consoles, it's a pretty close race between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Although the library for the Super Nintendo is just it's so good.
It's killer. It
really
has Super Metroid and Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
That's it. Like that's all I need to talk about. That's all I need to talk about.
All right, so
I have to shit.
You have to shit?
We're gonna cut it here then.
Cut it here then. Yeah, we can catch up with you guys later in the month with another episode.
I was gonna say I wasn't up to too much in the last 2 weeks anyway, so
I've been enjoying Ys 10 Nordics.
I've been playing Sonic Cross Shadow Generations.
You can't talk about that. Embargo.
I played through that, but that is for another time. We'll talk about that.
Embargo.
I got back. I mentioned in a previous podcast I've been getting back into Pokemon. I managed to beat Let's Go Pikachu for the first time, and after 6 years of owning it. The post game is actually kind of good. But I'm probably also never going to touch most of it because there's a lot.
Am I the only real Pokemon fan? Because I was the first one to beat Pokemon Let's Go Eevee.
I guess so.
I've never beaten Let's Go, and I traded in my copy to get the new Zelda, so I'm never gonna beat it.
I am the only true Pokemon fan on this podcast. That's sad and disgusting. You should feel ashamed for yourself.
I guess
the viewer, not you two. You two are fine, but you, the viewer, you should feel ashamed for yourself.
Yeah, and then I also have been playing through my copy of Scarlet that my girlfriend had got me a while back on Valentine's Day, and I'm actually almost done with it. So I'm going to be doing the DLC. So for that, going to be getting the last few Pokemon. I have like my completed like living decks up in home updated, so that's going to be cool. Been fooling around with like DNS exploits to get like special event stuff from like the DS games. Unfortunately, I can't get Gen 5 stuff to work. So like all the black and white, black 2, white 2 cool stuff, I just can't get a hold of it. But I got like everything from the Gen 4 games. I got the shiny Pichu that you can bring over to Heart Gold Soul Silver and get that like special special notch-eared Pichu. So that'll be cool. I'm saving that aside though, because eventually I'm going to get back to my Pokemon channel on YouTube. And when I do, I want to be able to like film that. So like that's going to be something I try to record. But no, other than that, like nothing new really. So, and I mean, Landon, you said you have to take a shit.
Yeah, I was going to say the newest thing with me is this bowel movement that's in the middle of happening.
Yeah.
But other than that, yes, Ys 10 Nordics. I've been playing that. I'm in chapter 4. I finally got to the point in the game where you can ignore the story. Finally. Like, not that I have anything wrong with the story. The story's fine. I actually really enjoy this game a lot. But the other, like, it's a game that I want to explore in. You have a pirate ship. They were telling me I had to go to these very specific locations, but also giving me side quests. But they were like, you can't do that. You can't go to that where that side quest needs to go. You have to do the story. And I'm like, I don't want to. I want to explore. So, but now I'm at the point where I can actually like fuck around and ignore the main story and actually like experience the game. It's very fun. You only have 2 playable characters in this one, as opposed to like 6 that was in 8 and 9, which means like your party feels a lot tighter. I care about the playable characters, whereas in that one, like I would stick to just like Adol and then just one other person. Even though you could have like you could swap between 3 to 4 people, I would only care about like 1 to 2 at most. In the last 2, and I really like fucking Ys 8. But I can only really tell you about one playable character outside of Adol and then Dana, the title character. Oh well.
Okay. So thank you all for watching. We got our little outro we're going to roll, and we'll catch you in the next episode. But take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.